be in the clear that language is always vague, and that the goal is not to not make it vague, but to define that vagueness as precisely as possible. So, about his problems with traditional approaches, he mentions Samson a few times, and who said word meanings is not accessible to scientific investigation, on which Hank does not agree. The problem with Samson was that he tried to create a more or less mathematical notation to capture meaning, and that did not work. And Hanks also prefers that it cannot work, as there cannot be a single theory, because words are dynamic and meanings are dynamic. One example he gives is how that mathematical notation didn't work is if we take the sentence person A bought bread, and or person B doesn't buy bread at the store, and example 2, person B doesn't buy propaganda on the street. The word buy has different meanings in that case. And the notation proposed by Samson did not account for those differences. He also criticizes how earlier linguists were very syntactocentric. They were very focused on the grammar of a sentence, whereas Hanks proposed the theory with the word in the center and the word embedded in its context. He also criticizes that there was no differentiation between normal constructions, normal usages, and possible usages, saying that what was analyzed was not actually representative of how language was actually used. And he criticizes the use of invented examples for different reasons, which I will come back to later. So that they were a recipe for self-fulfilling prophecies, and not, again, representative of how language is actually used, because human intuition is fallible. Here a quick overview of what we're discussing and how this approach is constructed. He's searching for word meanings and different meanings of words and how those meanings are changed based on context. He searches for examples of said contexts and phrases in very large corpora of spoken or written text by native speakers. And he differentiates within possible usage, as there is possible and impossible usage. There is no clear line between both. There cannot be. There's no clear divide, and data can never prove that something is impossible, that something cannot be used. In this case, possible usage is what is within grammatical possibilities of language. And in that possible usage, we have typical usage and atypical usage. Typical usage are the most common collocations and prototypes. Atypical is well, basically everything else. We have, we will elaborate on that later, norms, which are more rare. So we have combinations that are correct, are idiomatic, but aren't used as frequently, and we have exploitation of those norms. So everything that falls outside of the norms. To come quickly come back to those patterns he's searching for. So we have collocations, co-occurrences of words in text. Those are statistically significant if he finds them more than one in the corpus once. And prototypes, meaning phraseological prototypes, the most common phraseology collocations that happen the most frequently, words that are most likely to be standing in a certain order. That's what he focuses before coming to those actual patterns, we have to discuss what he means, how he defines natural language. He mostly talks about 2 points, 2 different aspects. That language is first governed by how words are normally used and idiomatically, and how it's kind of following some rules. And the second aspect is that humans always exploit those norms. We play with words in order to explain things that are somewhat outside of what the rules give us. That is one of his books, the later text. He also differentiates between 2 principles on how language can be conceptualized, on how it is constructed. We have open choice principle, which basically means that everything that is grammatically possible can be theoretically said, and the speaker has infinite choices on how to say those things. On the other hand, we have the idiom principle, which means that there is a certain amount of pre-constructed phrases, and to say one thing, there is a pre-constructed phrase one has to use, so we have only one single choice. And what he says is that those both principles play a role in natural language. We can't have just one, especially because of the 2 aspects I mentioned before. So in one part there is a certain freedom because humans tend to exploit what is the norm, and on the other hand we have what we call idiomatic language, what is most common. He also said that natural language is very vague, very fuzzy. As we have described before, there's no clear divide between the 2, what is normal and what is an exploitation of the norms. Lastly, one word in his conception, one word cannot be defined precisely. Not just because language is fuzzy, but also because it then becomes a technical term. Defining one word or one aspect of language, one construction, makes it devoid of any kind of freedom and creative potential, so it cannot be exploited as well. And that happens with technical terms. Going back to what I said before, so now we have typical usage, and within typical usage, he focuses on 2 main points. Is that there is no hard fast dividing line between normal and abnormal use. Anything can kind of be normal and sometimes be abnormal. It depends on how one approaches the subject. And there's also no hard dividing line between possible and impossible, as we said before. He says that gray area is very interesting to study, as there is much to study, but he also criticizes that early approaches very much focused on that very fuzzy divide and neglected typical languages and how language is typically used. Another aspect of typical usage or abnormal, atypical usage to keep in mind is that there are phrases that are cognitively salient and phrases that are socially salient. What he means is that one phrase, he names an example that is very easy to keep in mind because of that aspect, is it's about taxidermy, and in the phrase it says, remember to vacuum your moose, which is a very uncommon construction. And it's for that reason very memorable. It's very unusual, so it's memorable. And on the other hand, we have socially salient. Those are constructions that are much more common, much more normal, we'd say, but are unmemorable. So that is to keep in mind when analyzing words and phrases. It's one of the reasons one shouldn't use invented examples as well. Is because we tend to focus a lot on the cognitively salient phrases just just because we remember them better.
Mm.
We don't think about how we usually normally talk.
Sorry, that example was remember to vacuum your moves.
Yeah, it wasn't about taxidermy.
Okay.
It's not an example he invented. He just mentioned it, saying he read about it about 25 years ago, and he still remembers it. And what he says is that those two aspects, cognitive salience and social salience, are independent from one another, and even possibly inverse variables. One word is either the one or the other, and how much it is the one is independent from the other. And that's why human intuition should not be used as evidence, as we don't really have access to how we use language naturally. If we ask ourselves, how would I naturally use word X? Let's say, what are the most common collocation terms for widen or broaden and differentiate the two? We probably wouldn't find the same results a machine would in the corpus would. So we take examples, we invent examples that are not representative of our actual use of language. Our intuition is very much manipulated by our subjective views and our not that capable consciousness, I'd say. So what he says is we shouldn't use invented examples, absolutely not. And we should also first use a corpus, observe how language is used, and out of those observation form theories. Practical proposals, he made. He criticizes earlier linguists, saying they kind of pick and chose evidence that fit a theory they constructed before. He presents that as a pond, and he wants to find out what fish are in the pond, and other linguists try to pick out the fish in this very specific pond they built before. Okay, so now about typical usage and norms and how he tries to annotate those. That's what I meant with the PowerPoint sometimes disrupts the formatting I did before, but that's not a problem. So we have two examples: fire gun, fire an employee. Two sentences with different meanings and different meanings for the word fire. They have the same syntactic structure, so syntax is not enough to determine the meaning, which is why we need collocations. Some words have more possibilities of collocations, some have much less. For example, fire has kind of middle amount of collocators. We have fire gun, fire an employee. We could compare that to accumulate. The word accumulate can be collocated with probably as many words as there are examples in the corpus. That's what he says. Or switch, for example, has also a lot. We have switch on, switch off, switch places. Now for the word fire, if we wanted to describe fire as well, the action of firing a gun, we'd have fire, gun, rifle, pistol. That gun, rifle, pistol is a lexical set. Those are nouns that all collocate with fire in that same way. And we can notate that as fire plus firearm in those brackets. That is how we can name that unifying semantic type. Or we can also broaden it. Fire plus weapon, fire plus physical object. Depending on how we noted it, the word has a slightly changed meaning in the results of our analysis. Now, about atypical constructions and exploitations. He says people play with words and enjoy doing so. exploitations are everything that are outside of what we just saw, the normal usage of a word in a context. We have, for example, in comparisons, we have an exploitation. To describe an unfamiliar object, we compare it to something we know, something that is a bit similar, and focus on some of the aspects of that said objects and ignore others. If we say that this object is like a door, the word door is not used in the literal sense. Its meaning is not the same as when I say I opened the door. It's not the same meaning of door. Another exploitations are ellipses, a very extreme exploitation, as it says. Here we have an example out of a novel. It says, I hazarded various stewardess destinations. In that he says, hazard various something is not idiomatic, we'd say. He makes a whole analysis about the word hazard and comes to the conclusion that the norm for hazard is to be collocated with hazard a guess. And in that case, it is left out. However, if a reader reads this sentence, they usually do in the context of the whole text and the whole paragraph, where it is mentioned somewhere else that it's about guessing something and estimating something, which is why here it can be left out, and a normal reader wouldn't notice it. Now, if we take the sentence in its own, of course, we'd say it's not idiomatic, something is missing. Another exploitation in this sentence is the word steward-esque, a word that does not exist, meaning the characteristic of steward. It's a character in the book. A word that becomes a new meaning just in that said sentence. And exploitations follow their own set of norms, which, as he says, still have to be defined, because they are very complex and very different to the norms that norm regular and conventional language. Also depends on how those exploitations present themselves. Here, for example, as the esque at the end of the sentence, which makes us understand what he means, meaning of something or like something, and the word like in the aforementioned example that kind of introduces that exploitation. And that word like probably has a very significant meaning and significant impact on meanings in the sentence, usually. He says that that is something that still has to be realized. Now into the benefits of this approach. Hanks is very adamant that this approach will lead to a better understanding of meaning, that it will open new doors for further research in different fields of linguistics, that different problems we've had in linguistics will be solved because of the variability of uses corporate tools have, and that the patterns he analyzes can bring on new theories, very different ones, and also better insight into meaning. What he also says is that natural language processing programs can achieve better results. He kind of contrasts the statistical approaches he does based on the evidence he gathers through the patterns, and knowledge-rich, rule-based approaches, quite similar to how machine translations used to be. Remember, this text is from 2010, so some developments have been made since. He also says that this approach is accessible to everyone, not just to linguists, but on that specific field, but also in general linguists, but also to language learners, and that he says that pattern dictionaries, for example, will benefit language learners to have a better insight into natural language and how it's actually used. And he also says that he will be able to circumvent some in his opinion, a problem because they weren't actually representative of real language. For example, that as there was a bigger focus on irregularities in language, scientists seem to think that those irregularities were more common than they actually were. And he really wants to focus on the regularities and how language actually works, what actually goes on, he says. So, in summary, Hanks is very happy that large corpora exist, that they make it possible to analyze patterns of collocations, and they find evidence on how words are actually used. He really repeats a lot of times in his text that mental examples should not be used, cannot be used, as they do not give the results we want. They are very fallible. He says that language follows two systems. In order to master a language, one has to master both of these systems, the normal, conventional use, and the creative exploiting of the norm. One doesn't know exactly about the other. Language is always both. And also that there is no clear divide between what is conventional and what is unconventional. It's a matter of degree, it's a climb. And does not do to only analyze that middle ground, that fuzzy line. One has to also focus on the extremes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha. Questions?
If you go back to the page where you were talking about conventional usage versus unconventional usage with the example of the use, does it say anything about our perception of what is typical use of language change? Because I think there are words that we nowadays use in a way that it didn't used to be possible to use them like that before. Like words going from an abnormal, very irregular way of using them to just being the normal way to use the word.
Well, he doesn't focus on the change of language. What he does say is that one has to take the examples a corpus gives, even if the scientist thinks, the linguist behind the analysis thinks, oh no, that example is unidiomatic, that example is wrong, because the corpus should be, it should be a corpus that is modern and with a language that is used, the language one wants to analyze, and it should always represent how language is used in that specific moment. What he also says is that word meaning is dynamic. It always changes, not just depending on context, but also in time. And he also compares with the analysis of the word hazard, for example, which he focuses on in one of the sub-chapter of that chapter. He says that, well, the norm for one of the norms on how hazard is used is always hazard a guess. And that comes from another norm that was older, that is now a bit, which is now less used because language changed, but that norm kind of still exists in the background. It has it as being something that is done during gambling, for example. So it's not just hazarding a guess, but hazarding any kind of expression in that way. And he just said that these two norms still exist. They are separate from each other, and one is overshadowing the other because language just changed over time. He doesn't focus on change, he just focuses on the status we have at the moment of the analysis, whatever the status is.
I think that's an interesting point with this general idea in linguistics has been following Ferdinand de Saussure approach, exactly what you are saying, that this is strict, there is a strict separation between synchrony and diachrony. synchrony is the present state of the language, and diachrony is how language has been evolved, the history of language. And this was kind of in response to the predominant in the 19th century approach of historical linguistics, which derived lots of kind of looked at the object of language as the history of evolution of the forms and grammatical patterns. And there was this famous analogy with chess. He said that if you are following the game of chess, like observing how things have been developing from the opening till the middle game, and then he said that when you are looking at this game from the very beginning, and then someone suddenly comes and looks at this game just in the middle of it, kind of not recognizing what has been happening before. So there is no advantage or disadvantage. So you are exactly in the same position. So evaluating this, but I think this kind of Amuk's question so challenges kind of this perspective that with meanings of language, so I think we need to move a little bit beyond Saussure's separation, that sometimes it's like relevant how things have been, how we arrived here. So with yeah.
It's very interesting, of course, and I think it's also interesting how the author kind of leaves the door open for further analysis of how languages changes. He is talking about the status at the moment, but he doesn't deny that language changes, and that is a field that is very important. He just focused on one aspect.
Yeah. And I think that either in a different chapter of this book, or there is another chapter in the list of reading list, there was exactly kind of this question, how things have been changed historically in the course of language in historical corpus like early modern English and even the language of the 19th century. It would be interesting how things have been changed with norms and exploitations, that what usually has been an exploitation in the 19th century may be becoming a norm nowadays, which I think it's interesting point. With the innovation in language, I think it's also very important, like our memory, what has been used in these patterns. Like you sometimes have frozen metaphors, or like metaphors which have been overused and they become like dead metaphors. So you we are annotating, we have now a project on annotating emotions in a corpus, and this is exactly the challenge, that you have this concept Liebe and Freude as something which carries out emotions and annotates. So we need to annotate this, but we cannot just add Liebe into the dictionary of words carrying emotions, because you have this Liebe, Damen und Herren, so which basically maybe at some point in history meant, so people meant that I have some emotional feelings towards my addressees, and that may have contrasted with some other resources like sehr geehrte, or something like more formal things. But nowadays I think you're using it without actually expressing that type of so it's no longer an exploitation of the norm, but kind of becomes a norm that yes, in this sense I think might we can link it to this usage. Okay, any further questions? With the examples which you have given here, it's interesting, like from my perspective, if you see any like disagreement points with Hans, if there is anything that you feel is not quite
I feel that it's Well, he's very adamant in his
Mhm.
one
Mhm.
way of doing things. I think that maybe that patterns are a great way, but there are also other factors, and that syntax should not be ignored completely. I also think that invented examples can actually be interesting, not for analyzing how language is actually used, but how we think language is actually used to analyze that process within ourselves, how that dichotomy of cognitive salience works with social salience, how we humans kind of represent those both concepts within our imagination of language. So I think that's interesting. But yeah, as I said, it's difficult to not agree with him because his approach is just so broad. The chapter I had was an introduction to the topic, and therefore it was more of a start to an actual theory and method, more than a fixed way of doing things, for which I think he leaves so many doors open that it's difficult to find a closed door for something. He says that it's dynamic, it's vague, it's fuzzy, that language is just too complex, and sometimes there are exceptions, and sometimes what we think is normal use is actually an exploitation, or the other way around. So it's he's just so general in what he says that it's difficult to find kind of contrapoint.
That's a great point. Yeah. Any other ideas what might be like weaknesses of this approach, or on the other hand, maybe there is some idea how kind of to design experiment for the case study, so how we can use this model to investigate.
What this model lacks a bit, I think, is that well, in order to analyze something, it requires a huge corpus, really large corpus, and that would only work for the normal users, because well, he says an exploitation is only significant statistically if it can be found more than once, depending on the type of text one uses. For example, let's say I want to analyze lyrical texts. First of all, the corpus would be much more restricted if I'd use poems by one certain artist. For example, I'd have a small corpus, and the likeliness of finding exploitations that occur twice in the same way is very unlikely. So it's his model, and I mean that's how he constructed this, is very good at trying to find general rules for normal and conventional uses of language, and for some exploitations that are common, that are more common, but it also lacks the capacity to analyze meaning of rarer constructions. That's what I think.
That's very interesting points. Any reactions or any thoughts about this? I think this kind of links to what you said earlier, because it's one idea might be to actually look into these invented examples and see if kind of there is something about exploitation of the norms in these very rare cases, because basically what a poet does, she invents examples, she invents these creative things in like intuition. Like if you think about invented example in linguistic literature, this famous or infamous, how you interpret it, sentence by Chomsky: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So his point was to prove that grammar is completely independent from the lexicon, which we know nowadays doesn't work quite well with this idea of lexical priming, for example, when we looked into this model that you cannot separate grammar from the lexicon, but it's kind of very poetic sentence in some way. So you exercise this creativity, and
it has that very strict path on how things have to be done in order to find generalized theories. As he says, in creative ways as far as, well, we'd say no one would ever say that, but then one poet comes around and does exactly that. It would be a shame to not account for those very creative outbursts of language construction. As well, I think it's a bit of a shame that he says one should only use text corpora by native speakers, which makes sense if we want to analyze conventional use of a language within native speakers, communities, and groups. However, a language is never just used by native speakers. And not accounting for how non-native speakers use language and how non-native speakers shape language as well, because, well, if we take big languages such as English, a lot of people in the world speak English. There are a lot of people from other cultures which have very different mother tongues that are very differently constructed, and how they use English, maybe incorrectly, partly, shapes that language. But how can we say that language is still incorrect if a whole country is using it incorrectly in that way? Then it kind of becomes typical. However, he still sees it as an exploitation because he focuses on only native speakers. That is a very restricted view.
That's also my experience coming to Europe, and this European English is kind of you start to accept things which you wouldn't accept in Britain as kind of part of the norm. So you really kind of can see that this creative pattern may be influencing English. Yes, so you're absolutely right. So yeah, I think there are lots of potential lines of investigation of corpus-based research. Something like so you can use, for example, look into one idea which you mentioned, this non-native creativity in non-native language. There is another path, poetry and poetic collocations. Like there is, for example, the word howl, which is like the wolf's howl, yes. So but in poetry you can find like howling blast or something like the connection between two words which are not collocates but just one-off, and it gives you metaphor, it gives you lots of emotions and impression, and maybe if that's overused with time it kind of loses its creativity. So this point with the history and connection to the losing of novelty can be interesting. And another direction is how things have been invented, these invented examples in all the dictionaries, when people wrote dictionaries not using corpora but just inventing examples, and how things could be contrasted. I think even in the early 50s there was a movement in philosophy called analytical philosophy or linguistic philosophy, when they said that the language problems, philosophical problems, are created when the language is not at work but at on holiday. So when you are like using language in a way that is not typical, and creating some context in philosophical texts that shouldn't be there because it's not how things normally occur. And I think there is a philosopher named Austin, and he wrote a paper about the word sorry and excuse me, and so this plea for excuses, but he invented all these examples, so it will be interesting like to contrast it with these examples, these invented examples, and real corpus-based evidence is like there is this tension. So I like this paper because it kind of opens lots of doors, metaphorically speaking. Yes, so lots of interesting ideas. Okay. Any other comments or questions? If not, Nadesh, thanks so much for your presentation. So, and I think we have now Valentina's presentation.
This analysis was carried out on data taken from a range of British newspapers and texts from the UNHCR, which stands for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is basically the UN Agency for Refugees. And both of these sources were published in 2003. This article is not only an analysis of the two sources separately, but also of their similarities and differences. And also the BNC, the British National Corpus, is employed to identify typical language patterns, which are then compared with the results from the two more specific corpora. So, first of all, I will talk about the type of analysis which was carried out, and then I will explain the reasons and motivations behind this analysis, and finally I will go into detail and focusing on the investigation on itself, so of the terms refugee and asylum seekers both in the UN corpus and in the news corpus. So what kind of analysis is this one? The paper analyzes concordances around the term refugee and asylum seeker and display all occurrences of specific words or expressions which are within the text corpus and show them in their immediate context, which means before or after the keyword, which is in this case, as we said, refugee or asylum seeker. And identifying concordances is important because it allows for the observation of linguistic phenomena like collocations or colligations, semantic preferences, or semantic prosody. And the objective of this study is to explore how refugees are constructed in news and UN discourse, and more specifically also to investigate the phenomenon called hierarchy of credibility. And this means that the public tends to accept the opinions of powerful or privileged individuals because they are considered more competent or better informed. Yeah, so let's delve into the analysis. As we've said, we're going to analyze the concordances, and based on this analysis, these concordances are then categorized in categories of similarities. We have, for example, quantification, which is one of the most common ways of describing refugees. Sometimes numbers are described as growing, like for example, more and more refugees. And in some of these cases, the types of quantification used also suggest that the volume of refugees is troublesome, like for example, a mob of Afghan refugees, or pelted by, stones by up to 100 refugees. Or also that the growing number is alarming, like straining under the weight of refugees, or the camps are filled with refugees. In these examples, refugees are linked, therefore, to a dangerous mass or a heavy load. It is also interesting that they are constructed as a liquid, and we will see also with the category of movement that there is this water-based metaphors. So yeah, there are different kinds of movements. There is the use of verb phrases which construct refugees as victims or a collective group which are undergoing suffering. For example, we have fleeing refugees or refugees who are hunched against the backing wind. There is also the movement of metaphors which are linked to water. For example, swelling the numbers of refugees, the flood of refugees. Refugees are streaming home, overflowing. In the BNC, streaming occurs mostly in a negative context and collocates often with words like tears and blood, whereas flood and overflowing are connected to water and tragedy. And in this sense, refugees are constructed as sort of a natural disaster and an elemental force which is difficult to predict and has no sense of control. The movement of refugees is also described in terms of word quantity. For example, roads heaved with refugees and are packed with refugees. and also closely related to the notion of packed refugees, is another set of movement descriptors which are associated with the transportation of objects and goods. So refugees are delivered, carried, transported, etc. And also smuggled. And in the BNC, smuggle collocates strongly with lexical words like cocaine, heroin, drugs, and also trafficked collocates with narcotics and drugs. And therefore, refugees are also constructed in terms of metaphors, which portray them as transported goods and, in particular, illegal substances. Another recurrent theme is that of tragedy. Refugees are described as tragic, like for example with expressions like plight of, despair of, and tragedy of. And in the BNC, plight collocates with words which are connected to powerless identities like refugees, homeless, unemployed women, etc. It also collocates with highlight, which shows an attempt to heighten awareness around a group which is deemed to be oppressed or unfortunate. And connected to this is also the official attempt to help. So we have, for example, refugee action, refugee service, which focus on external efforts to help actively refugees. Another category which is not found in, for example, in the UN corpus is that of crime and nuisance. It is a less common discourse, but it's still present. And it's also interesting that the presence of refugees is deemed to push down housing prices or causing a rise in crime. And in this sense, they're also viewed as a sort of threat to capitalism, since their presence reduces the value of property in general. And refugee camps are also reported to be hiding grounds for extremists or militants, and etc. How are refugees described in the UN corpus? There is still the category of quantification, which is very similar to that of the news corpus. However, the difference is there's more focus on the refugee nationalities. There is a much broader and more detailed range of nationalities, and the word refugee is often preceded by adjectives like former or new, which suggests that the condition of the refugees is seen as temporary. We have also, again, aid and assistance. Many of the left-hand collocates of refugees in the UN corpus reflect official efforts to help refugees. And we have terms like solution, assistance, aid programs, support, and etc. We find again the discourse of tragedy. They're again described as tragic nuances. However, it is less frequent in the UN corpus. It's a discourse which still exists, but it's less frequent, and also a term which doesn't occur in the news corpus is vulnerables, and here it occurs. We have again the movement category. So many of the collocates, left-hand collocates, are movement-related verbs like return, transfer, displaced, and influx. And the study goes into more detail about displaced and influx. Displaced occurs often in agentless constructions, which is interesting because information about who is doing a certain things is obscure. And so, for example, we don't know who displaced the refugees. There's no responsibility taken. Whereas with the case of influx, in the BNC, there are collocates of influx which are, for example, Sutton and Co., which suggest that an influx can be unexpected and problematic. It is also interesting that displaced and influx in the BNC also occur in scientific settings and refer to the movement of liquids and minerals. And this suggests that they are linked to the metaphors of refugees as water used in the news corpus. However, a word like displaced has a less emotive value than words like streaming, flood, and overflowing. And so therefore the value judgment is dependent on how the water is described. And it is also interesting that the UN corpus does present a few emotive water metaphors, like flow of, stream, swell. And this is significant because it shows that even humanitarian agencies like the UN adopt dominant metaphors, which are used by politicians, journalists, and editors, for example. Okay, let's talk about asylum seekers. First of all, the strongest collocate of asylum is seekers, and in the BNC seek as a overall positive discourse prosody, but there are also collocates like mental and lunatic, which therefore present a negative meaning associated with mental illness. That being said, the representation of asylum seeker is very similar to that of refugees, but the categories which are encountered are not as clearly defined in a way. Again, two of the strongest ways that asylum seekers are referred to are nationality and numbers, but in many cases numbers are left vague. For example, thousands of, majority of, numbers of, and quantification is also present in relation to changes in numbers, like fewer people applied for the largest number, etc. Asylum seekers are also, again, constructed in terms of being vulnerable to danger, and the term issue of and plight of, which is in relation to the category of tragedy, construct them as a problematized group, and the verb face is often used to show that asylum seekers are in a difficult position, but even then they continue to face serious problems securing residence. Again, asylum seekers are constructed as needing help and assistance. This is a discourse which acknowledges the fact that they face multiple difficulties, and verbs such as assist, enable, and help are used to help asylum seekers adjust to these difficulties, assisting asylum seekers. A different category is the issue of deserving. This is another discourse surrounding asylum seekers, and the phrase claimed asylum occurs several times in the UN corpus. In the BNC, claim collocates with damages, compensation, and falsely, and therefore the term is strongly linked to the rewards of claiming and whether the claim is viewed as deserving or not. And linked to this issue are terms which describe what happens to asylum seekers who are not found deserving, for example, rejected. Again, interestingly, regarding the subject of rejection is that who does the rejecting is not specified, so again, unclear agency. And this brings me to something which is not a category, but I thought it was important to talk about. And there appears to be a pattern of obscuring agency by not specifying who is responsible for a given action. And this happens with terms that we've seen like rejected, but also first returns. And another solution to avoid agency is the choice of words which stand as a label for a type of person or group. Therefore, being a form of impersonalization, like a first return doesn't need to specify the agent. However, there are some cases in UN corpus in which the agency is made clear, like for example with the term deport. Malaysia deports asylum seekers. So yeah, asylum seekers in the news corpus. Similar to the UN corpus, the news corpus presents instances of quantification, but the news corpus does not mention specific asylum seekers by naming their different nationalities. And in general, there are more differences rather than similarities between these new corpuses regarding the word asylum seeker. For example, in the news corpus, there seems to be a more negative pattern surrounding the term asylum seeker. For example, with reference to the issue of deserting. The news corpus favors negative collocations like failed, escort, or deport. And not, for example, a more neutral term like rejected, because rejected is less personal and emotive, and it implies that it's the application that has been rejected and not necessarily the person. Whereas failed is more personal. And another difference between the UN and the news corpus is that the news corpus presents a wider range of terms which are related to honesty of asylum seekers and specifically to questioning such honesty. Like for example, genuine, illegal, fraudulent, false. And this is important because frequent collocations can prime on one another. For example, the two collocates illegal and immigrant might lead people to view immigration as illegal if associated frequently. Interestingly, unlike the UN corpus, the news corpus engages with legislative discourse in relation to the term asylum seeker. It contains references to descriptions and evaluations or of legislation which affect asylum seekers, like for example, asylum bill, asylum and immigration bill. There are also commentaries addressing public concerns about asylum seekers and related legislation. An example is the case of collocational words and phrases such as fears over, outcry over, quibble over, and expressed opposition to. And there are also descriptions of laws that make it harder for people to obtain asylum, which are described as curbs and crackdown. And continuing along this line of this negative pattern, there are various aspects of asylum which are described in terms of metaphors with reference to violence or war. For example, the process of seeking asylum is seen as sort of a minefield. For example, the sensitive issue of immigration and asylum in particular is provided to be a minefield for ministers to negotiate. So, to sum up, this corpus-based analysis reveals significant differences in how refugees and asylum seekers are constructed in the discourse of British newspapers as well as UN texts. Both corpora share some common linguistic patterns, such as the quantification and movement metaphors. However, the news corpus tends to frame these groups more negatively, and associating them with crime, for example, threat and legislative controversy. In contrast, the UN corpus adopts a more humanitarian perspective, emphasizing aid, assistance, and the temporary nature of refugee status, although it still occasionally uses dominant metaphors that can carry negative connotations. And it also highlights how agency is often obscured, in particular with references to rejection and forced returns, which also serve to depersonalize responsibility. The study also reflects the phenomenon of hierarchy of credibility, where the views of powerful voices, such as those of politicians and the media, tend to dominate public discourse. And this mechanism contributes to reinforce negative or alarmist representations of refugees or asylum seekers, especially within the news corpus. And overall, the study demonstrates the power of language in shaping public perception about refugees and asylum seekers, and underscores, I think, the importance of critically examining media representation, also to better understand the political implications and social implications. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you, Anita. So I think it's.
This was also, it was quite an old study
Mhm.
from 2003.
Mhm.
Things have changed in the meantime. I still think it's a very sensitive
Mhm.
topic, especially in
Mhm.
countries which are, well, the UK, for example, or Italy,
Mhm.
where it's a very current topic.
Mhm.
But I also think that in some ways it's still current
Mhm.
in the negative light in which immigration is depicted in general.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was very
Yeah.
interesting.
Okay, so any questions? There are several very interesting themes, and yeah, so you, what you mentioned, now is one of the things which I actually wanted to ask. The study in 2003 and the discourse there so was very much influenced, I think, also with this idea of hierarchy of credibility. Yeah. So, and I'm just wondering, in what sense things have changed, and maybe with respect also to this hierarchy of credibility, is there something that we have now which hasn't been that prominent in 2003?
Well, I'm not an expert on
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
topic whatsoever, but
Mm-hmm.
I still feel like it's a relevant
Mhm.
discourse of hierarchy
Mhm.
of credibility.
Mhm.
However, we certainly have more access to information and to question such information, and so I feel like it's probably more of a trend now to question
Mhm.
people in powerful and privileged position. So I think there's probably I don't know what kind of tools were back in the day accessible, but now also with the rise of technology and social media, especially a lot of people also are informed through platforms like Instagram or Facebook, which are not necessarily reliable sources, but sometimes yes. And there are more, I feel like there's more access to different voices, and therefore it's easier to see different point of views and question truth that is sort of given to us. However, I can think about only Italian newspapers, which is what I maybe have access to, and I feel like it's especially and there's a difference between newspapers who are inclined in different political directions. Like there are newspapers who are more on the left, right side, and left, and it is quite not obvious, but it's clear how different political views shape also different idea of towards immigration, and of course the far right is against, and they tend to use also terms which are like clandestino, which means illegal immigrant, and very often, and also maybe in not a accurate way, because it's also, while newspapers in Italy are also very based on sensationalism, and also because they're, I think, targeted towards people who still consume that sort of source. Whereas the left, of course, is more concerned with the, I feel like the integration
Mhm.
discourse.
Mhm.
So I guess it's still a
Mhm.
prevalent
Mhm.
topic as well. Hierarchy of credibility
Mhm.
still influences
Mhm.
the masses. However, it's easier also to have access to
Mhm.
reliable information
Mhm.
and make up your own mind about the topic.
Mhm. That's, yeah, any other thoughts about how the technology, this social media, for example, might have like influenced the changes in our approach in this discourse? Because I think that there was this point people like I think we mentioned this in our course last semester about ideology in translation, that people like Timothy Snyder, for example, so they make the claim that this technological change where basically everyone has their own newspaper, so you kind of climb up this ladder of hierarchy of credibility, so and this hierarchy becomes pretty much flat because you have the power to like create your followers, and so there are these bubbles appearing there, so with people like in echo chambers reinforcing the views, and things are becoming like very much driven by this technological space where the responsibility, the politicians basically not only get the influence on the social media discourse, but they also, this position comes with the responsibility for some kind of influence with some decisions, possibility to be elected or re-elected in the next term, or credibility of political party, and so there is at least some accountability for the choices. If you are in echo chamber, if you are an influencer, you are not limited with this type of responsibility, credibility, so you kind of can write whatever you want on, like writing something on the fence, so and you basically can step outside this hierarchy and undermine or challenge, and so and I think Timothy Snyder says that it's very much comparable to what happened in the times when the printing press was invented in Mainz here in Germany. So the access to information becomes much cheaper, and this, according to his account in history, resulted in several centuries of religious wars in Europe, which kind of wiped out a large proportion of European population. So and kind of we came basically to terms with that many centuries afterwards, but that technological change in the way how information was operating in society was destroyed, and destroyed the previous settings, and so his claim is that we are now facing this very much technological challenge compared to that, and for example local newspapers very much in decline now, that people get information not from local newspapers but from these social media and these platforms.
Especially physical. Many newspapers now have an online platform.
Yeah,
There's also that.
exactly. And this user-generated comments, so you kind of can create this hate speech, and so it's kind of very much unchecked, uncontrolled, and things, how things are framed is like pushed outside of the restrictions which have been there, and it's maybe not that political party is like creating this hierarchy of credibility from top down, but it's if a politician like AfD politician or some populist politician like Trump actually gets on top of this wave of hatred and kind of gets into the office brought by these echo chambers, and so
Of course, I feel like newspapers,
mhm.
it probably has always been like
Mhm.
that, but political faction, then each newspaper sort of portrays the political agenda of one of these different politicians. So I guess it's a discourse which could be done also about the left in general. I mean, I feel like every newspaper does this kind of work. And that's why I feel like there's more of a rise about also around independent information that can be easily found online. It's also not restricted by a fee.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess there's also that. I feel like newspapers are more something that my parents maybe still read. It's not something that my generation, I feel like, as I can see from my small circle, it's not something that is used anymore. It's more read to out of interest to see how information is sort of used against or in favor.
Yeah.
So,
Good. Yeah. Right. Any? Well, I just wanted to ask maybe everyone here. So, is there kind of some hope in this configuration of the framing of this? Is there some source from which like we can like challenge or undermine this model that so basically what I see in this discourse, even the UN corpus, so it still kind of uses these metaphors where basically it's not even the problem that they are reusing these dominant metaphors, it's that asylum seekers, refugees are very much denied agency. So they're portrayed as natural forces, natural disasters, so, but they are not like actively involved. So you very rarely find a sentence, if you find this sentence, it's not kind of makes it to the top of your collocations, that, for example, refugees contribute to the economy also, where refugees is the subject of some verb which is like requires some active agency and has power in society. Is there some way how we can, like, is there a way how things could be changed or undermined or kind of with this?
it's quite difficult because it's also not on our hands really, but probably also changing the discourse, the way we talk about refugees and asylum seekers by giving them an identity, maybe telling also more specific stories. I think it might serve to not view them as you said as a group without agency, as sort of a mass that's coming towards Europe and destroying everything. And it's easy not to feel sort of empathy towards something that is not even human. So that's I feel like the point of using such metaphors, because it detaches the reader from the people involved. And so I guess I think in a way it's not about immigration at all, but I feel like also with the Palestinian conflict right now, I feel like I read a lot of independent newspapers of really talking about specific stories of depicting them as the victims that they are, and I feel like that is to create a human connection is certainly a way to render people more aware of what's happening, which is what the Israeli government doesn't do with its citizens. There's a lot of, information is manipulated, of course, so it serves to desensitize readers and people who have access to viewing reality in a critical way,
Mhm.
also,
Yeah.
without sort of being transported by this.
Mhm.
Because I guess that emotive
Mhm.
discourse is also, I mean, yes, let's create more connection, but also
Mhm.
this is often used in a negative way.
Mhm.
So also less of that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
what they want to create is maybe rage or
Mhm.
indignation or
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
also that, and
Mhm.
also have the sensibility to have empathy
Mhm.
as well as not get
Mhm.
overwhelmed by
Mhm.
these triggers of
Mhm.
anger, and
Yeah.
I feel like that's a way that
Mhm.
every single person can
Yeah.
do something. And then there are also,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, people who have more power in this
Mhm.
sense. And
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. Any other thoughts of?
I'm just thinking, like, I believe these are structured groups, like for a long time, agencies using these words. I don't know
Mhm.
when
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
goes by, so it would be interesting to look at that way, how it is structured and how it can intensify, and yes, and how it will be in the future, this kind of groups. Because like, we are doing this, so like, yeah, we will pass away, but someone will do this continuously. So
Mhm.
this can be a different approach to look at it. And we are looking at right now, but 50 years ago, maybe like looking at how it's structured,
Mhm.
it would be different.
Mhm.
Research would be just good.
Yeah. Yeah. I think. Yeah, that's a good point. We have the power to change things, like especially as translators, so just change the perspective, for example, change and I think this point about empathy is very interesting. So I think there is a Guardian columnist and author and public speaker George Monbiot, I think, and he's written a book about neoliberalism and limitations of this neoliberalism in modern society, and he says that the resource which we have is empathy. It's like even children on playground. So there is some group which is very much unempathetic, but some group kind of is very natural part of people's nature to have empathy. And yeah, so we as translators have this power of using language like these metaphors, even as writers, as journalists. So we can change this perspective and basically ask, like, put the frames that have the framing right. Yeah, that, for example, if we compare things with this expat, the word expat and migrant, yeah. So it's basically the same thing, but expat is used completely differently. So positive, yeah, and they have power, they have like their groups, and so things are completely different. And this refugee, asylum seeker context, migrant context, is very much hijacked by these so non-empathetic discourse. And it's very much like discourse about Brexit in Britain. There were two camps, but both camps kind of made use the same frame. So Brexit is either like beneficial for, so we get more like benefits if we do Brexit, or we don't do Brexit. Yeah. So if we stay or leave, so what is the impact on our economy? But it's, I think, from European perspective, is the wrong question. It's you basically should ask not what Europe does to you, but what you do to Europe, for Europe. So what that we together can explore space, for example, create better education system, create better like economy, and so together. And this European identity was never part of this frame. The discourse of Brexit discussion on both sides, and that's kind of asking the right questions and choosing the right frames, I think, is something which could give us hope, and I think in some sense.
Yes.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Good. Any last minute questions or comments? If not, Valentina, thanks so much for your very interesting presentation. And I think this is everything we have time for today. So we'll continue with your presentations about the ideas for essays next week and then the following week, and that will be the last 2 weeks of our course. So there's nothing else. So we'll see each other next week. Yeah, so you will come today,
Yes.
right? Yes. So
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, see you. Mhm. Mhm.